And eliminate noise and add film grain, a film grain look, and also how to use the various sharpening tools in Lightroom. So first thing we're going to do is learn how to reduce the look of noise. As we just got done talking about, noise refers to digital photography, and it's a over-amplification of the electronic sensation going on in the sensor, kind of a digital static that happens in order to try and make the camera more sensitive to low light situations. It can also be caused by underexposure, scenes that are underexposed, or when we use a really high ISO, depending on how sensitive our camera is. This is image. When you correct for noise, the one thing that noise and sharpening have in common in Lightroom is that when you correct for or you do those two things, either noise reduction or sharpening, you should be viewing the image at 1:1. When we view an image at 1:1, we see what it's actually going to look like when it's printed. So there are a few functions in Lightroom where you always want to review your image in 1:1. When you're retouching the image, when you're sharpening, when you're adding clarity, and when you're reducing noise or adding film grain. It's important to look at the 1:1 view. So this image is photographed with an early point-and-shoot digital camera manufactured by Kodak, and I'm photographing the outside of the George Eastman house where George Eastman Kodak once lived. And so here we're going to migrate over to the development module. And I'm just going to turn my before and after off here because we don't need it on. And the palette, or the panel rather, that we're going to be working with is called the detail panel. So notice that the sharpening adjustments and the noise reduction adjustments are housed in the detail panel on the right-hand side. Let's take a look at the different noise reduction tools. There's a full set of tools for luminance noise, which is noise that's black and white. Notice that the detail and the contrast are grayed out right now because first we have to inch forward the luminance in order to see the various settings here. And if I turn up luminance all the way, you see that it doesn't do a lot to the color pixels, but it completely blurs the black and white details of the image. You see that? Completely blurs the black and white details of the image. If I turn it on in the before and after view, we can see, and I'll reset the development settings that I have on here, we can see just how blurry the black and white adjustments get if we turn the noise reduction off, because the black and white pixels are what hold the sharpness of the image. The noise reduction tool is a blurring algorithm. It actually does blur parts of the image. So you have to be really careful not to go overboard. You have to view your image at 1:1 and maybe not use 100% luminance. The detail and the contrast sliders help us maintain sharpness while we're blurring the image. And that sounds counterproductive because it is. So we just want to go easy in the luminance slider here and work with the detail. So remember that detail adds sharpness to our midtones, and contrast adds edge contrast, which makes the image look like it's sharper. So the goal here is to do as little as you can, go as minuscule in amount as you can while still getting a positive result. I'm not seeing a positive result much with the luminance slider, so I'm just going to set it back to its default for right now. And let's work with the color slider first. The color slider we should definitely see a difference in. And we're going to inch the color slider up a little bit by a little until we just start to see the color noise disappear. Did you see how it becomes minimized as we go up? We don't want to go all the way up because, again, this is going to result in particular details that could become blurry. Okay? So we really just want to go as far as we can with the slider in the most minuscule increments as we can until we see the color pixels disappear. The other thing you might want to do is see what it looks like when you add zero detail. A little bit of the color comes back here. So adding a little bit more detail, what that does is it just maintains sharpness in the image while you're blurring out the color pixels, if that makes sense. Okay? So that's how the color noise reduction works. This image doesn't really have much noise in the black and white areas, so there's not a lot of need for applying a luminance adjustment. If you have an image that does have noise in the luminance areas, let's just look at, we can kind of look at this image. It's not the best example, but here we have an underexposed image that's a little bit noisy. Let's turn up the luminance reduction, and you can see that it gets softer. So the desired effect is that it's getting softer, and you can see it's getting smoother in the midtones too. But sometimes, if you're not careful, it can get too soft. So to avoid becoming the image losing its sharpness altogether, you want to just reduce this back to the lowest amount possible, and while you're still seeing a positive effect. And then you can also bring in the detail slider here to help maintain the details of the image. All right? Sometimes when an image is so noisy, you can't really reduce the amount of noise enough without making it too blurry. So what do? Do you just not use it? Oftentimes when an image is too noisy, sometimes we can't correct for the noise because we end up making it too blurry. And because it's so noisy, sharpening doesn't really have a positive effect on the image either. So some of the options that we can do are to actually add what's called in the effects panel, add grain. So grain is not necessarily the same as noise. It references traditional black and white photography, but it can mask noise, and it can mask an image when it's unsharp. Watch what happens if I start to add grain. Notice that the grain's coming in here. So if you have an image that's not very sharp or an image that is noisy, sometimes adding grain can actually hide some of the problems in the image, such as an image that's not quite sharp, or it can help kind of break the noise up into a more controlled pattern that's more pleasing to the eye. All right, and you can control the roughness, how soft the edges are, or how rough the edges are, the size of the grain. This is golf ball size grain right here. And then the amount, and that's non-destructive. You can go back and change that at any time. So if you want a photojournalistic feel, this adding grain can be nice in an effect, but it can also be nice when you're trying to compensate for an image that just isn't getting sharp, or one whose noise reduction is not helping. So there's a little inside tip for you. The other thing we have under the lens correction panel is the vignette. And this vignette is intended for images that have not been cropped. I tend to not use this vignette. I tend to go with this effects panel under post-crop vignette, the one that's nested next to the grain, because this affects images that have been cropped and that have not been cropped. And you can move this to the left, makes a vignette that's dark, to the right makes a vignette that's light. Vignetting originally was created to correct for accidents, and then we kind of fell in love with the way that it looked because it reminded us of yesteryear. But this vignetting style was, especially the light vignette, was designed to compensate for photographers that had on a lens hood that was too long for their particular lens. So if you're using a wide-angle lens and you have a lens shade or a lens hood on your lens that's a little longer than intended, the lens can actually see the hood sticking out and create a dark vignette. So adding a white vignette corrects for that. If you just want to add a vignette for stylistic reasons, you can go dark. We can modify the midpoint here, how small the midpoint is or how wide the midpoint is. A really, exaggerated amount around the edge creates kind of a slide look. Less so is a little softer. The feather is the feather around the edge. You can go with a hard look or a light look. This is a more natural look, is kind of more traditional. And then you can lighten up the highlights that might be peeking through if you want to give those a little more exaggeration. So if I zoom in, I can see my grain. You can't see grain when you're zoomed out, much in the same way that you can't really see the effects from sharpening or noise reduction unless you're at 1:1. Speaking of sharpening, let's take a look. I'm going to go ahead and go to this image. It's an image of some fish that's being prepared for dinner. It's making me hungry here. And we'll go ahead and put it in the before and after state so you can see. So what does sharpening do? If we turn sharpening all the way up, we can see what it does. What sharpening does in a software program is it finds the edges of the pixels and it increases their edge contrast. So it doesn't actually optimally sharpen the picture. You can only do that with your lens. But what it does do is it increases the contrast around the edges of the picture so that it gives us a perception of the image being sharp. One of the big mistakes photographers make is that they over-sharpen images. There are a lot of different techniques for sharpening. You're going to find that people have different things that they like to do. There is no one-size-fits-all amount particular settings because all images are different and they require their own treatment. But what you can do is sharpening is, now notice when I turn it off, right? This has a default applied to it. This is with 0 sharpening added. Sharpening is required for camera raw images. It's part of the demosaicing, unpacking of a camera raw file. Remember how we said camera raw files don't hold all of the information within the file until you run it through a camera raw processor like Lightroom? Well, sharpening is one of those things. So we can see that this is not a very sharp looking image when we turn off the sharpening in Lightroom. I'm going to update the camera raw processing version here. But when we add sharpening, we're going to see the image improve. Okay? Now, some of the things that affect the amount are things like radius. If we turn sharpening all the way up and radius all the way up, you can see how strange it looks. Radius spreads out. The smaller the radius, the less number of pixels are affected at one time. So the goal is actually to keep the radius pretty small, anywhere maybe from 0.3 to 1.0, unless you're going for a strange edge effect like this one. Okay? So I'm just going to dial down the radius because I just really want to find the edges of the image, because the edges of the image are what I want to be sharp. And then I'm going to dial down my sharpening. My technique is to get it how I think it looks good on screen and then reduce it by about 10. So if your image is going to print, it's going to look very, very sharp. It's going to look sharper than it does on screen. So I tend to reduce it by 10. If your image is going to the web, you can leave it where you think it looks good. All right? So I'm going to turn this down. What about detail? If we turn detail off, all of a sudden the midtones don't look as sharp, right? If we turn detail all the way up, all of a sudden the midtone edges of this image have a lot of contrast. And that's exactly what this is. While the amount affects all the edge pixels, Detail affects the edges of pixels that only have midtones. All right? So amount is amount of overall edge contrast throughout the image. Radius is how many pixels you want to affect. And detail has to do with going in and targeting the midtones. Some people like to just turn the overall amount off or turn it just on a little bit and really, really work with the detail. It really depends how much midtones your image has in it. Masking is a feature that was added primarily for portraits. I'll show you. We'll skip to a portrait here. Wait for it to come into view. So long as your portrait is sharp, hopefully this one is in focus. No, this one is slightly out of focus in the eyes. Find one that is. So long as your portrait is sharp, then sharpening works really well. But generally in commercial photography, okay, I think we're just zoomed in a bit. This is a fairly noisy image. We'll go back to this one. In commercial photography generally, we don't want to sharpen the skin. We just want the eyes and the mouth to be sharp, the hair to be sharp, but we don't want to sharpen the pores of the skin. So masking allows us to take away areas that we don't want to be affected by these 3 sharpening sliders. And we do that if we hold down our Option key and scroll forward with the masking. See, if I don't hold down the Option key, it doesn't show me the mask, but if I hold down the Option key, what this does is it allows me to block the sharpening filter from the black areas and only affect the white areas. So now if we look at this, the fish is not being sharpened, but the edges of this parsley is. So this is particularly something that people use a lot with portraits. Okay. Also, if I hold down the Option key with my detail slider, I can just find the very edges of the details in this image. Radius also shows me, radius shows me the very edges that I'm looking to target, which is at about 0.5. Detail shows me that it's just the midtones that I'm working with. All right, so the workflow as a review in Lightroom, once you get to the Develop module, is to kind of go in order from basic on down. The only time when you don't go in order is when you are converting to an image to black and white. I would do that first, then jump back up into the basic panel and make your modifications, because the mixing that you do in black and white does have an effect on the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks of the image. But generally, when we work on the details of an image, the sharpening and the noise, that happens after we've done color and tone corrections. So let's take a look at the lab that we're doing here. Here's some good, here's a link to this video that I'm making right now, and then a link to a Adobe TV video here at the top. A description of what noise reduction and sharpening the photo does. So your lab assignment is to work with 2 different images that have noise reduction added and 2 different images that have sharpening added. So a total of 4 images. On 2 of the images, you're going to work with the noise. On 2 of the images, you're going to work with the sharpening. If you don't really have any noisy images, you can turn in that one of the Eastman House and any of the other ones from the sample folder that I have in there. So 2 images where you are going to name them NR 1 and 2, where you've worked with the noise reduction, and then 2 images that you've worked with the sharpening. So a total of 4, okay? And you're going to put them in a folder called Lab 11 Your Name and put it in the Dropbox.